All right. Well, thanks, Gene and John and Brittany. I really want to open it up to you all for questions. This is meant to be a little more interactive. Wanted to give you that context that they provided, but yeah, I've got an initial question, and that is what the slide asks is, so what's next? I mean, Gene, you've been at it for a number of years, and curious what you see as the kind of next challenges you're wanting to take on, and Brittany, you're on the opposite end of that spectrum pretty early on. Like, you know, what's next for you guys in accomplishing the missions of your organizations and leveraging the stuff that you've done already?
Let me turn this on. Kind of what's next for us is, and you saw it at that first slide, and you can see how we've morphed from something small, which was just the EIP tracker, to something a lot bigger, is we're starting to be able to link all the actions that are happening through that capital improvement program, the environmental improvement program, to outcomes, which has been really key for us. So we're seeing like the actions that are happening through those projects with intermediate results, which we see through our monitoring programs that we built out we're starting to build out on the platform, to outcomes. So we're starting to see, are we getting close to those restoration goals that we set? And we can see through what we call our threshold dashboard, the status and trend of where we are. So that's been really exciting for us. One of the things that we started, if I can just anecdotally say, is this is not the first time the Tahoe Basin has gone down this path. In the early 2000s, we built something we called the Tahoe Integrated Information Management System, TIMS. But we decided we were going to start like the really big thing and try and fill in all the gaps underneath. What we built was a system that kind of collapsed under its own weight. We were trying to be everything for everybody. So somebody said it's like building the space shuttle instead of the Volkswagen that we needed. With this process, we took a different approach. We learned from that lesson, and we said, let's build something small, build it really, really well, have it get huge user buy-in on it, and then because the platform is modular, is then start building off of that. So that's where we've come, and really, for me, it's just starting with that EIP tracker and having so many people use it and like it. I think almost every week I'm fielding something. It's like, oh, we should put this on Lake Tahoe info, and let's build this. And so it's just been really exciting to seeing even though the system's 4 years old, it's constantly being modified, and there's a lot of people are excited to use it.
I think I alluded to what's next for the RCDs, and I imagine this being a planning conference, some of you all work for small cities or communities or regions across, and getting a bunch of groups doing similar work to be reporting similarly, so you can both compare and collect your information to talk about a broader impact. I think that's my next step. So our next step is to open it up to the rest of the RCDs across the state in January. So what I'm really looking at now is like, how do we make sure people are using it in the same way? How do we make sure that they're trained? How do we make sure that they have what they need to implement it? What do we do with the people who are too busy or not interested in doing it? So it's really working on kind of the people aspect of expanding it across the state is kind of what's next for us. And then as we use it more similar to Gene's experience, we just said, oh, wouldn't it be great if it did this and that? So we actually have a list going with Sitka, a wish list, that as we get funding, or maybe as one of our partners who's using it funds something similar, we can start to kind of check those dreams off the program, which I think is really good to have something that's alive and changing with the needs of the organizations who are using it.
Thank you. I think what's next from my perspective as the project manager of these tools is really building a user community. I think initially it was a kind of consultant-client engagement between Sitka and TRPA, and now we're starting to see this more as Sitka being the stewards of a community platform that is open to contribution and use by others. And so starting to get together user groups now that this is the first time that Jean and Brittany have met, and seeing the conversations that are just occurring on the fly by getting these two users of this technology together, and the idea sharing that's occurring. We'll be bringing in folks from the Clackamas Partnership for a meeting later today, and this is really our first start of a user community around the project tracking system. So I just see that growing as more folks sign on to start leveraging the investments that have already been made, and really forming a community of project tracking and performance metrics, and building sort of standards and shared interests and shared investments moving forward is really the future for as I see it.
Yeah.
I have a couple of questions, but I just want to respect your format. Do you want me to just ask the questions, or do you want to back and forth today?
No, please go ahead. Let's keep it casual. We've got a relatively small group.
Okay, so I guess my first question is, how comprehensible is the system to the average stakeholder? Because I think I have to compliment all of you for creating a really what seems to be a very effective way of tracking it for all your internal agencies that are in place, and it's public enough. But the average stakeholder has varying levels of comprehension, and some of it could be technical, and some of it is actually just, hey, what am I going to do? And I'll just sort of piggyback that off. If the outcomes, if they're public enough, are not what is desired, what's your mechanism to follow through? And do the partner agencies still want full reports and things like that, despite all of this? So I have another sort of secondary question, but I'll let you respond.
So I'll just start with your first question about the comprehension. And what I've noticed, because I've been touring this for a lot of people for the first time, is the things that they're interested in learning about that they can understand. So if they're interested in where are you spending your money, that information is really easy to see, and it seems like they can understand that. I think when you're talking to someone who's interested in just how much are you doing for soil conservation or fish freshman, if they're interested in that specific information, then they already understand. And then the general public, if they're just interested in what's happening around, I think there's varying depths of information in the reporting, so I think somebody can get something out of it. And as far as feedback, I'm really interested in that, because I think you're taking something, at least in our case, that has been in paper format that people would have to kind of submit a public request act to get that information. Not that you're trying to hide it, just that it's not published in that way, or it's some link in the depths of your website. That I think we will be potentially opening ourselves up to, well, why did you spend it on that instead of something else, or why did you decide to do this? And so I think that'll be an interesting, is that what your question was?
Well, not just monitoring of spending the money well. It's more also an issue of, hey, we started this process, the actual metrics are falling below our benchmarking.
Mm-hmm.
We did the best we could under those circumstances at that time. The science has changed, or the ability to monitor has morphed because everything's moving so fast. Do you have ways of sort of saying, based on this kind of output that's public or however it's organized, we have a way to respond? And of course, in a multi-agency or a multi-entity kind of issue, it sort of raises all sorts of questions about, so not just the issue of who's responsible, and put that away, more it's like, hey, what do we do? So I think those kinds of, that would be a legitimate stakeholder question, not just have we spent our money well.
Right.
It's more about, let's do it better if it's actually not working. How would you create that system inside this?
I can probably answer that one better just because of the way Tahoe is structured. So we have the actions that are happening through the Environmental Improvement Program, but my agency is kind of on the hook. Even though we're not implementing projects, we're on the hook to make sure that we're meeting our restoration goals. So what we do is every 4 years, we do what we call a threshold evaluation. So we do, it's a measurement of where we are progress-wise. And with that evaluation comes some recommendations. So it's really an adaptive management cycle. So it's like, are the projects that we're doing getting us the right thing that we want, the right results? And if they're not, where do we need to adapt? And so that sometimes can be adapting through the projects, adapting through regulations. So my agency's in a better way, like the Tahoe Basin's in a better way to deal with that because we do go through this constant adaptive management cycle. Really, for us, the Environmental Improvement Program tracker was just a way to show people, it's like, here's what we're doing with the money you gave us. But what we've been able to do is morph the system to be bigger than that, saying, here's all the monitoring, and we can start seeing, even before we get to that 4-year evaluation, that the trend, like maybe these projects aren't working and we're seeing like the monitoring going down. So how do we respond to that as a collective in the Tahoe Basin?
Yeah, I mean, I just have one comment on sort of quick thing, so the issue, it just strikes me that from a stakeholder point of view, if you had a mechanism basically that in layman's terms, or rather as close to layman's terms you can get to these rather technical issues, here's the value of what you're getting. You might actually save a lot on your outreach and saying, trying to build a positive code, sort of a constituency for more funding or for other kinds of intervention. And you're getting actually ahead of the game because you're building a cumulative campaigns, that kind of thing. But the other sort of issue is that notion of how do you sort of move away from a static design model of saying, here's our fixed benchmarking and here's our sort of metrics, if you will, and get to a more dynamic system where you're saying, as we get better information, how are we going to be able to sort of not just inform, and that just gets to my last question, which is how public actually is a set of assumptions behind the metrics. Because a lot of it is black box, right? So you kind of have to take it on face value and say, that's what you guys are doing, I have to believe that output. But there's a lot of intelligent people out there that says, I don't know what the algorithm is behind it or whatever, and if I know what the assumptions are, then I can sort of accept it.
That's something that is a fine line that we balance because you don't want to overwhelm people with information. The way the system is built is that you start at pretty high level, and if you want to get down, you go through the different layers. So pretty much everything on this website is available. So as we start building out all of our monitoring protocols and how we monitor things and what the data is showing us, all that's public available. So, but for the lay user, that's not meaningful for them. So we balanced it, keeping it high level at the beginning for the lay person who wants to come in. But if you really want to delve into what is this data showing you? How much fine sediment particles are being taken out of this stormwater vault? You can get that information, and that's something that we've just started really opening up. It's really taking all of our data that we have, that live in different reports, that live in different spreadsheets, and trying to daylight that so that people can use that information, not just our agency.
So just the last comment, really. It's all very fine to talk about sedimentation levels and salmon migration and things like that, and those are great for environmentalists. But I would just simply suggest that if you created simple correlational diagrams or dependency diagrams to say, if this happens, that's what's happening further downstream, as a logical consequence of this anomaly or this success, however you want to do it, it would be a lot easier for average stakeholders to say that's the value of it.
I really appreciate that, and as Gene has said, the goal of this Lake Tahoe Info platform is to connect the actions to the outcomes, and one way that Sitka has thought about this is through what's called the Open Standards for Conservation, which is a set of practices that basically builds models or theories of change, where there's a structured process where you say, if we conduct these actions at this scale, what are the causal chain of events that would lead to the change that we're expecting to occur, and in building in systematic feedback loops. And so that's really a separate piece of work that Sitka has developed for the Foundations for Success. It's called the Marathi is the name of the tool that's used for building these theory of change models. And so that's something that we're just beginning to dip our feet in, kind of connecting the kind of public transparency project-based system to a greater formal system for tracking theories of change. But the issues that you're raising are all, they're very, very hard, and they're the front of our mind, and I can't say that we've solved all of them, but I think we're getting the building blocks in place and beginning to wire them together in a way that I really haven't seen other agencies do. But we're talking multi-year, 4-8-year periods, or the level at which the adaptive management takes place to review and adapt a threshold standard or change the list of things that are being measured. It's not quick, and maybe that's appropriate because we're talking about measuring environmental data and you don't see change on an annual basis. These changes occur over a decadal basis or more longer, and I think TRPA really does have the processes and the stakeholders in place to conduct these reviews. They're right now between the 2015 and 2019 threshold evaluation periods, and they've just launched an initiative to systematically go through and say, do we have too many threshold standards, and can we whittle down some to focus on the ones that matter, and are we really reporting the right, invest a lot of money in tracking these thresholds? Are they really shedding the light that we want to on the expected outcomes?
Yeah, I can appreciate the challenge.
Other questions? Yeah.
Does development data from the cities around Lake Tahoe make it into the data set in terms of things like building permits and impervious surface and those sorts of things?
Is he a plant?
Like private reporters.
Right.
Yes. Yeah, all that information does make it in, whether we're having the individual, reporting on an individual basis per project for those projects that are happening on those private parcels, or whether it's collectively. We have memorandum of understandings where we've delegated some of the environmental review to local jurisdictions, and so they report to us on an annual basis what's happening on private property. And that's kind of a key thing on this, is that as redevelopment projects happen on private properties, we do realize environmental gain. And so reporting that is really key to showing the private contribution to restoration in Tahoe. So every developed parcel is required to have what we call best management practices, which means they have to infiltrate all their stormwater runoff on site. And every time that a private property develops that, it gets counted into the system and gets rolled up into how many parcels have stormwater B&P retrofits. So and any sort of what we call like land coverage changes on the parcel. So if you're in a sensitive, like a wetland area, you're required to, if you do a project, to retire some of your land coverage. All that gets counted and then goes towards the reporting of where we are on that threshold indicator. So we do get all that information.
I would just add, it's not exactly the same question, but resource conservation districts work primarily with private landowners, so we are really thinking about being sensitive, because even if we're doing environmental benefit projects, we've had occasions in the past where then environmental groups will say, well, if you improved the water quality this much, then they must have been polluting before you improved it, so we're going to go ahead and sue that person for polluting before you fix the problem. So we've been really thoughtful and built things into the system where we can identify a location and set it by a point on a map with very specific to maybe a watershed or a sub-watershed. That way you're still reporting on the outcomes, but you're protecting the identity of that landowner from being sued, which is important because we do only voluntary work with landowners. So if we start reporting everything and then they start getting legal notices from people, then they're not going to be interested in working with you anymore or doing projects. So that's something that through this system we've been sensitive about. We want to make sure things are as transparent as possible, but also protecting people.
Just by way of brief illustration, this is a different area of the system, but I wanted to kind of illustrate. This is the Parcel Tracker component. It's been integrated. It started out as a separate system. We brought it together. But this allows folks to look up parcels, and it has information like the BMP, the best management practices status. This one happens to be not certified, but you can see this is another part of trying to make this information transparent and available to folks, and both citizens and developers and real estate agents and whoever. Yeah.
I'd be curious, perhaps abstractly, how in engaging with these kind of new platforms, how you've integrated or challenges in integrating existing technologies like your internal GIS databases, and if you probably have like some kind of parcel viewer and maybe it's okay for some things but not everything, making things work together.
Well, if Matt would scroll down, well, actually, just on this page right now, on what he's showing here, is where it says BMP status. That's actually talking to a database that we have internally at my agency, which tracks the status of BMP, of best management practices on parcels. Then if he scrolls down, many local jurisdictions have, or even down to the very bottom, a lot of local jurisdictions have permitting software. We do too, and we have one called Acela. I'm not sure if people are familiar with it. What we've done is we've worked with Sitka to find a way that it actually talks to Acela. So the information that's summarized in these two boxes here is directly from our Acela permitting software. Acela is not very, I don't mean to hammer it, but it's not very user-friendly. We have citizens access, but it's like you send people in there and they don't know what they're looking for. It's really complicated. What we've done is we've been able to summarize this information here. So we have a summary of all the permits that we've issued. And also if we scan it, it shows up as a PDF on the bottom. So these two systems are talking to each other. And as things are updated in Acela, they're updated in this system. As the system, we have some workflows that happen within the system, they talk back to Acela. So that was a really key moment for us when we were able to get those systems talking to each other. And I think it's really helped, especially daylighting that permitting information that people need. It's really cut down the number of people that have to come to our office and dig through files. We're able to show them what we have right here. And it also talks to some of our GIS, also our GIS data. The information that's up at the top where it has parcel number, the address and all that, that comes directly from our GIS information. So we've developed a set of web services where these systems are talking to each other. And there's also a way that other jurisdictions can pull in web services with their systems too. So the California Tahoe Conservancy has a web service where they're using information that's in here that links directly to their information. And as we start getting information from, like I said, we have memorandums of understanding with other jurisdictions, because there's 5 other jurisdictions, counties and city in Tahoe, is we're starting to get their information and incorporating it into the system too. So what we're trying to do is take all these, so you don't have to go to my agency and go to the local jurisdiction and get information. It's trying to bring it all together in one platform.
Regarding the GIS data integration, I would just say it's just really important to designate what the system of record is for a given piece of information, so you're not making simultaneous changes in 2 systems and then have to be reconciled. That's really tricky. There's pieces in the Lake Tahoe info platform where the spatial data is collected in this tool, and this tool is then the system of record. And then there's other pieces of spatial data where the enterprise GIS, ArcGIS Online, is the system of record, and we flow the data back. And so as long as we're clear on which is which, they can share their data back and forth.
Yeah, and that's a good point, is trying to be very clear on what the system of record is, because we don't want to have people duplicating entry and being, okay, so this is where this happens, and then it feeds into this, whether it, so that's been a very key thing that we've been very clear about doing as we start opening this up to having more information feeding into it.
Yeah, question in the back?
So from an implementation standpoint, I'm on the techie side of things, so I'm wondering, have you had to hire additional staff to support this tool? And if so, are they IT folks, are they GIS folks, are they planners? Or have you bought into the notion that you're essentially going to be paying Sitka or a consultant to do ongoing maintenance and enhancement on this product year after year after year?
When we started this system, it was built for the partnership in Tahoe, but TRPA committed to maintenance and funding the maintenance and hosting of the system. So the system is hosted with Sitka, and we pay a monthly fee to Sitka to host and maintain the system. It's actually pretty nominal. It's not a large fee. I think we're paying, what is it, like $4,000 a month, maybe? No, not even that. No.
800 a month?
800 a month for the hosting and maintenance of it. That does not include development, but that's just like fixing bugs and things like that. And in terms of staff, we have not had to hire anybody else. I'm a planner. I'm an administrator in the system, although I do have to rely on Sitka to fix the bugs. But one of the things that we did do when we did this is we wanted the original RFP said that everything had to be open source. So if we decided we didn't want to work with Sitka anymore, we could go on to another consultant. They could take it up and do it themselves. But you know, in the era of not having everything in-house anymore, we've kind of put that out to have that system kind of managed and hosted externally from our agency.
TRPA, sorry, just to clarify, TRPA also has data analysts and GIS analysts that are on staff. And so they're tapping into the system and doing what they need to do.
But it hasn't been any new staff that we've had to hire to manage it.
Right. And there's initial conversations about them adding data products and daylighting those through the system. And so that would be a way for them to increase ways they're communicating the information with their own staff that wouldn't involve outside folks and kind of building up their capacity. And if they ever wanted to get to a point where they're committing code, the platform, you know, obviously supports that being open source.
And our scenario is much different since we're mostly a collection of small agencies. My experience so far is we haven't hired anyone new. Like, I have a degree in biology and environmental studies, and I administer the system and help train people. So it's really simple, and then we collectively share the cost of the maintenance, which ends up like for each RCD being like $10 a month or something, really affordable. And the more people who get on board, the more affordable it becomes for us. And then we also collectively fundraise to add new features. Because we're all funded in different ways. So far my experience has been like, you know, not taking an extra bit of time to be the administrator, but nothing that I would have to like hire somebody to do. That's a good question.
Is there another question?
Yeah, I have what might be a difficult question.
The last one wasn't easy.
It's difficult because I've dealt with this myself. I've worked on a couple of decision support tools that are GIS-based in different parts of the world for different reasons. One is aspirational, one might be resource, regulatory, and so on. And in each of those instances, I run into this issue of the more open the data is and the more sort of public the consequences are of doing that kind of cumulative mapping. The inevitable sort of reality is that you're taking away decision-making authority from somebody. If you're really creating a kind of an open platform where, you know, so, you know, without mincing any words, I would just simply say, do you run into that problem, or do you anticipate that at some point, if there's too much information out there and it's subject to interpretation by a variety of people and intelligent people as well, then does that mean that it sort of puts a bit of a constraint on your ability to say, but that's how we want to manage it, or that's our comprehension of the problem, and we're ceding that over to a much bigger and more complicated discussion with stakeholders in the public. It's a difficult issue because it gets into the issues of what I call the democratization of data.
So our scenario, I think, is maybe different in a way because we're self-reporting kind of what we want to report at this stage. So no one's required to do anything. It's really just a tool to get information out there. So we're not setting ourselves up for failure in any way. That said, we have had to make compromises. So maybe where you normally would call something X, now we've collectively calling it Y. And so there's some compromises you make in just being able to roll up data across multiple organizations and regions. So you might have to be changing things a little bit. But I'd say because we're self-reporting and choosing what we're reporting at this point, as we get going, I don't see that as an issue yet. And Tahoe might be different. They have a plan they're following. They have goals. We have just a need to get information out and be able to have it be collected.
And for us, we've kind of swung back and forth because before the system, back when we did a threshold evaluation in 2011, there were a lot of people who accused us of cooking the books and reporting what we wanted to report because it wasn't daylighted. So when we did our last evaluation in 2015, we didn't get those accusations because we did put it all out there. So there's a balance, and I know from a project perspective, there were some issues. So when you propose a project for the environmental improvement program, you have what you think are your expected performance measures. What do you think you're going to get out of this project? And you know, when you implement a project and you go through and you try and get money and you go to design, often you think you're going to do 5 miles of bike trail and you end up with 3. So what we try to do is find a way to explain why we didn't accomplish what we thought, or when we get to a point where we start moving into, through the system, we might have expected benefits in there. When we get to a point where we're implementing the project, those expected benefits get hidden to the public. So that was a way to, because you have to show what you expect you're going to get in order to get funding for a project, but you don't want to be held accountable in the end, like, I couldn't do this, so what was the reason why? So we've hidden that, but we're also, I think, as a partnership, we're getting better at telling the stories about why it's difficult to get projects done and why maybe they're so expensive, or, you know, why does it cost millions of dollars to retrofit like a mile of a highway in the Tahoe Basin. So I think it's kind of forced us to be talking better about what we're doing and trying to tell, it's really about telling the story about what we're doing.
But do you think you'd get more traction if you were able to say these are the limitations of what we're doing, and it's not surprising that we did achieve our benchmarks at this point?
Yeah, it's holding us more accountable, and I think that's what we've been able to say.
Regulatory decisions that are fairly fixed over long time frames, and the political decisions where folks who are accountable to their voters or their base. And we haven't really run into anything at that very high level of decision making where the tool is getting in the way of the autonomy of the regulators or the elected officials. At the management, executive management level, we've had broad buy-in. Those folks tend to want help in making decisions and want justification and basis to make the technical decisions that they have to make. And so I think at the executive level, I've only seen positives and buy-in. I think if we came to a point where this tool or a tool is kind of providing recommendations that are contrary to where an executive wants to go, I haven't seen that in this platform. I don't know if is that something that you could speak to, Matt, in terms of some of our larger federal clients? Or
no, I mean it happens, and we've run up against that with other bigger projects and federal clients where there is some pushback on being overly transparent because it allows folks to say, well, find fault when they don't really understand, they can't understand all the implications that go into it. And, you know, salmon and the Pacific Northwest is a classic example of that, where there's lots of factors and political aspects that need to be looked at, tribal treaty relationships, and lots of things that go into how that resource is managed. And sometimes that causes that as system builders, we try to do what we can to make the information available, but at the end of the day, how that gets told and how it gets presented is it's ultimately up to the people who run the program.
Yeah, I can see they were very fortunate in Tahoe to have an executive level that sort of wants that kind of openness, and probably the structure of what you've done doesn't threaten the decision-making process too much. But I can fully appreciate chain growth. I run into that problem a lot.
Sure, yeah.
Whereas at the end of the day, the more open the system is, the more you're threatening somebody up and down the chain in terms of their capacity to make independent decisions.
Yep.
And it's a political decision on that part.
You had alluded to kind of having a little bit more transparent theory of change or results chain. And John shared that we've done a little work in that space. The performance measures that are in LT Info, that are in the EIP Project Tracker, were actually one of the processes that they used to arrive at those was to establish a results chain for each one of those. And that was part of the original set of kind of documents that where the selection, identification and selection of those performance measures was made public. And I think that foundation is, it's hard to draw a tight line back to 2009, 2010 when those were done, but I think that created a foundation where we're using logic to identify what these performance measures and how we want to choose to measure ourselves. And I think that kind of set the stage early on for the tone and tenor of how they wanted to manage the program. I think that helped. Other questions? Well, we are at 15 more minutes. I've got a couple of questions. You guys are, welcome to hang out, of course. One of my questions was back to the question or the story I just told. The process of selecting performance measures and how to get a group to agree to them. I know, Brittany, you just went through that, and I think the performance measures are still, people are still questioning them, and you're still not settled, and it's a big, difficult challenge. And I'm curious if you could speak to your initial experience with that, and if the way you did it, if you would make any changes to that, or what you learned from that initially.
So the way we had intended to do it was to have a representative group of conservation districts as well as agencies we were reporting to make sure that we were reporting to them the things that they want, and people who could reflect on to make sure they could understand those performance measures. What we actually did was we had one person create a list of performance measures based on her experience and then send it out for review. And pretty much everyone's like, looks good, until they start actually using the system more, and they're like, well, actually this, and actually that, and can you add this, and I actually do that. So I think if the system actually started so fast that we wanted, it was like a chicken and the egg thing. We wanted people to use the system so they could give us productive feedback on what was working and not working in the performance measures, but we wanted to have performance measures for them to use in order to get feedback on. So I think I would have spent a little bit more time brainstorming, although I think we did really, honestly, the woman who did this is a big picture thinker and a regional planner with a lot of experience. I think she did an excellent job. We've had very few changes requested or like, they're like, less on the performance measures, but what model are we using to come up with those, or what is the data source we're using, or how do we make sure that we're collecting it in the same way? Or are we using, metric tons versus like regular tons or whatever, so trying to figure out just little nuances like that. But I would say that wasn't ideal for us in the beginning, but actually has worked out in the end. But we're about to launch it to a lot more people. So I imagine we'll be getting more feedback. But what's great about the system too is that we can make changes. And while it's still early, it's not that much extra work if you had already reported one way to have it switch to something else slightly different. So I think that's been one of the great things about the system, is actually how easy it is to make improvements working with Sitka.
From my perspective, we did the opposite. So back in 2009, we brought all the partners together in a room and tried to hammer out performance measures. And I'm not saying that the 34 that we have are perfect, but they're basically chosen for political reasons about the message that we want to put forward for the program. So everybody kind of had their pet performance measure, and there was a lot of compromise made, a lot of subcategories of those performance measures in order to get them to a meaningful set. And, you know, in terms of the politics, we have the number of fish planted for Lahontan cutthroat trout because that was Harry Reid's pet project in Tahoe. So we had to do it. So some of these are just ones that Senator Feinstein and Senator Reid really, really wanted, so we knew we had to do them, and other ones are maybe a little more meaningful. One of the things that, as people are using these, and they're 8 years old now, they're maybe not the best of what we want, but there's not a lot of appetite for people to get back into that process and refine them. We're doing that right now for our threshold indicators, so that's for the whole TRK program itself. We have 178 indicators that were developed back in 1982. So they're not the best science, but we're in the process of updating those and getting them down to a set that we can actually meaningfully, well, actually feasibly monitor, because the monitoring system, the way it is, if we were to monitor all of those, we'd be spending $5 million a year on monitoring, and nobody has that kind of money to do it, or time. So, through the system, what we've been able to see is that when we take all the performance measures and throw them all into one place where we have it on the data center, we're starting to see where there's overlap. So maybe maybe we're collecting it for one program, and maybe it could be used for another program. So trying to really get a handle around all those performance metrics that we have, whether they're indicators or performance measures. This system has actually been really good for us because we've been able to put them all out there, start seeing where there's overlap, and then starting to refine them. But again, it's a mix of politics, the political message, and then what actually makes sense.
I'm reminded of the Oregon Progress Board and the Oregon Shines project too. I'm a city planner, so I don't know a great deal about that, but I remember hearing about it in planning school in 2000. What a great vision that is, in my opinion. But the difficulty of assessing statewide benchmarks for everything, education, environmental planning, you name it, and agreeing on the number of benchmarks and then tracking them over time. So clearly it's political at that level. I guess as a land use planner, the scope of this appeals to me a lot more than that kind of really open-ended and state-guided process, realistically. So it's been interesting to hear this.
And that's something that we're dealing with, especially through our transportation program, because there are like mandated things that we have to report from a federal level, like bridge condition and things like that. And it's like, how do you factor in those things that you have to do versus things that are kind of more meaningful versus the political things? So trying to wrap your head around performance metrics is really, really difficult.
Yeah.
So just to shout out to one of our partners, the folks that did the original work to come up with the 34 and kind of facilitate that conversation is a group called Environmental Incentives. It turns out they're based in Tahoe. They have offices around the U.S. And we often get involved with projects and clients who want to build a database, who want a new system. And if what we found the hard way over many years is that if the program doesn't have a good set, strong definition and understanding of its objectives and an articulation of how it wants to measure itself, then investing in a database or a system is often not the best place to start. And so we regularly encourage those conversations to say, well, why don't you take 5 and at least start the process of bringing together your stakeholders to get an agreement and a discussion going on how you want to measure this stuff, and then the system has a chance to survive because it's actually managing and reporting information that more than a small handful of people care about. And so they're really good at balancing all the stakeholders and the public and private interest and the brain of nonprofits and creating a pretty collaborative environment to start to work on that problem. So it's been helpful for us for sure. All right.
Lunchtime.
Yeah, let's do any questions. Well, thanks a lot for coming to our panel. If you guys have questions, we'll be knocking around for a bit. Appreciate all the questions and dialogue. Thanks.